a common issue that affects relationships in general, and in particular when it comes to communities of friends and communities of people that are together. God created us all very unique. And the very fact that people with different character traits can actually bond with each other is, I think, miraculous. Just as God is able to connect all the organs in a body that they should sync well and work together, and it's called koach hamafli in Hebrew. Koach hamafli means the wondrous power that is able to bring them together. The same thing is true in a community. However, it's not our natural default system. The natural default system is to always treat others with suspicion. There are two interesting readings. There's a funny story that's told about a rabbi that was invited to do a funeral in a small town, and he was standing in for the regular rabbi who was sick, but he didn't know the deceased, and he started talking with all the attributes of that individual. And every time he said another attribute, there was a man in the back that was stopping him and say, "You're all wrong. He wasn't a nice guy." Or "You're all wrong. He wasn't a scholar." Or "You're all wrong. He didn't treat anyone with a heart." And anything that he said that was positive, this guy in the back negated it. So the rabbi was stumped. He says, "Can anyone say at least one positive?" The same guy gets up and he says, "Yeah, his brother was much worse than him." So in other words, that was the positive. We work very hard to create what's called a positivity bias. The natural bias is a negative bias. Negative bias. Some people have a negative bias about themselves, and some people have a negative bias about others. We're going to introduce you to some terms, and I'm going to do something rather than reading all the readings. We're going to show a video, if it works, which actually says a lot about that, and that'll be the only video of the evening. Let's give you an example. If you're hiring an employee and you have a lot of positives about this employee, and all of a sudden one reference gives one negative about that employee, or two negatives. You have 8 positives and 2 negatives. Would you hire that person or not? Probably not, because the negative has much more of an influence. If you think about someone that's done a lot of favors to you, but they did one wrong to you, will you remember the favors or you'll remember the wrong? You'll remember the wrong. We'll see another example. If you're driving the highway and it's bumper to bumper traffic, and all of a sudden some person is on the shoulder speeding by, what's going to be your reaction? Is your reaction going to be, "What a jerk, he doesn't respect rules"? Or are you going to say, maybe he has an emergency, and maybe his wife is in labor and he's running to the hospital? We don't tend to do that. So the idea, that is called FAE. I was wondering if I can say it here in Charlotte, but FAE stands for Fundamental Attribution Error. I want to try to see. Can you mute yourself, whoever is unmuted?
Have you ever wondered why we remember negative experiences more vividly than positive ones? It's due to a concept called negativity bias. Negativity bias is our tendency to focus more on negative events. It's why insults linger longer than compliments, and why bad news grabs our attention more than good news. This bias deeply affects how we judge others. For example, a study found that if an interviewer initially liked a candidate for a job, just 3.8 pieces of negative data about the candidate were needed to change their mind and reject the unlucky applicant. But it took 8.8 pieces of positive data, more than double, to shift an initial negative impression to a positive one. Negativity bias is rooted in our survival instinct. Ignoring good traits isn't dangerous, but overlooking bad traits might be. So we're wired to be on alert for negativity and to err on the side of caution. Now let's explore another concept that affects our judgment of others: fundamental attribution error. Imagine you're stuck in traffic and a driver cuts the line by riding the shoulder. Your instinctive reaction might be, "What an arrogant jerk." But that reaction is a classic example of the fundamental attribution error, where we overemphasize personality traits and downplay situational factors. Who says the driver is arrogant? Maybe they're rushing to a hospital, but our minds instinctively jump to internal attributions. That driver is entitled, instead of considering external situational factors. Of course, sometimes the person who behaves negatively does have negative characteristics or intentions, but research has shown that it's not nearly as often as people think. Understanding these two biases, both well documented by research, raises important questions. How do these biases affect our relationships? What can we do to reduce their impact? What do you think?
Okay, so in today's lesson, we are going to not explore how we can fix people. That will be in the next lesson, lesson number 5, how to influence people. Again, I'm going to ask, since I don't have access, if you are unmuted, I'm speaking to the people on Zoom, please mute yourself, because every conversation that you have is being broadcast to the entire city. So unless you want to share with us your secrets or your cup of coffee or whatever it is, so please mute yourself. I will announce it periodically. I still hear some people, but I have no control today. So I'm sorry about that. Okay. We are going to talk about the fact, where does this negativity bias come from? Why does it come? Now, you remember, we talked about the animal soul, right? The animal soul is focused on self. The animal soul is focused on survival. It's focused on self-preservation. It's focused on its needs. We call it the animal soul because it's like the animal. What does the animal do all day? The animal all day is looking for food. It's looking for survival. Contrast that with the divine soul, which the divine soul is totally selfless. The divine soul is trying to connect with godly sparks. So this negativity basically comes from the animal soul. It's a bit of a selfish perspective that we project on other people. So again, fixing these problems we will discuss next week. What are we going to do today? First, we're going to divide this class into 3 sections. The first section is, how do we overcome negativity bias? It's there, but how do we overcome that? The second thing that we're going to do is overcoming the fundamental attribution error. We spoke about the FAE. How is it that we always attribute that fundamentally that person is not a good person, right? And instead of saying maybe it's a situational situational cause that's causing the person to act that way. And third, which is most important, we're going to be discussing a beyond just good relations advice to understand what is the deep philosophical insight of every person, and see that actually the perspective, which is the default, is the incorrect one, but there is a higher perspective of how to look at other people. So we're going to start with the first one. And here is a chidush. Let me give you a little introduction. Chidush means something novel. Maimonides wrote 14 volumes of the review of the Torah. It's called the Rambam of the Mishnah Torah. In one of the first sections, he has a section that's called Hilchot Deot. Hilchot Deot means the laws of attitudes. What would be the right attitude towards life? He doesn't speak even from a religious perspective, speaking from a human behavioral perspective. And he writes the following. He writes, people are born with multitude of different behavioral habits that are ingrained to them from birth. He says, for instance, you can have someone that is a spendthrift. They will not spend even an extra penny on themselves. It hurts them when they have to go to the grocery store and buy groceries. They'll always look for the sale. They'll always look for the cheapest. They'll look for yesterday's baked goods so they can get it for 50%. And we actually knew a guy like that who came from Israel, and he was a spendthrift, and he died without a family, and he had stashed away hundreds of thousands of dollars in his accounts, did nothing with it. And it was a very big fight because it went straight to the state because he had no descendants. But that was his nature. The Rambam then says you have people that are the opposite. They are reckless with their spending. They don't think twice about spending. They have a credit card, they'll rack up the bills in the credit card. They get a paycheck. By the time the middle of the week comes, there's no money left. They'll buy everything, an opportunity to buy. So he says both attitudes are wrong. There has to be balance. It's called the middle path. Derech HaMitzua, it's called in Hebrew. The middle path. The same thing is true in not only in spending, and also how to deal with people. Some people are so in love. Have you ever heard the term smothered in love? They can smother their partner in love and they don't give them any space. Other people are so removed that they are apathetic and they have no feelings whatsoever. Both of those ways are wrong. There has to be a middle path. The middle path actually is the greatest because the fact that it can balance the two opposites means that it is something which is so powerful that can do both. So that's what's called the middle path. He gives other examples. He gives many examples in life where a person can be on one extreme versus another extreme in their behavior. It could be the same thing about eating. You can have someone that doesn't eat because they are always afraid of gaining weight, so they become anorexic. Or you have people that are always afraid there's not going to be enough food, so they pile up their plates with so much food until they stuff themselves. So neither of those ways are right. The middle of the road, the middle way is the correct way, okay? But what happens if a person feels that they have a hard time going to the middle road, or they have a hard time how to deal with life the correct way? So generally we say that character influences behavior. That's the character. When you see a behavior of someone, you don't judge their behavior, you judge their character. You say they're a flawed character, and for that reason, they have this flawed behavior. The Rambam comes along and says you can switch it around. You can actually have behavior that influences character. This is something that the Rambam introduces, which is so powerful. Let's see how the Rambam writes it. So look at page 149. This is the word, character influences behavior. The Rambam comes along and says, no, behavior influences character. So he says, how can we cultivate proper attitudes and traits? And see what he says here. He doesn't just say, how can we cultivate proper traits? He's very careful of what he writes. He says, how can we cultivate proper attitudes so that they become ingrained features in our personality? So he says we engage once, then a second time, and yet a third time in behaviors that embody the balanced ideal. The balanced ideal is the balance between one extreme to the other. We repeat the desired behavior consistently. Eventually, the proper actions become natural rather than difficult, seamlessly integrated into our character. Now, this is a very novel idea. I'll give you another example, and this is something that the Rebbe introduced. When the Rebbe introduced in 1974 the 10-point mitzvah campaign, he didn't introduce new mitzvahs, but he emphasized mitzvahs that can be done that remind you of your Judaism, and it's a good thing. Like the women should light the candles, the men should put on tefillin, the people should have mezuzahs. But one of the things was mitzvah tzedakah, the campaign of tzedakah. And how did he introduce it? He introduced it to the following. He knows that he's talking to charitable people. People at the end of the year or at the end of the month to make a calculation of how much tzedakah they're ready to give. And if someone wants to follow the laws of the Torah, they know that 10% of their income has to go to tzedakah. If someone wants to be more generous, they can go to 20%. You can't go more than 20% unless we used to say Rothschild. Today we don't say Rothschild because nobody knows a Rothschild. The Rockefeller is, so you say Bill Gates. But otherwise, the norm is either 10 to 20%, okay? So the Rebbe said, even if you give the tzedakah and you write a nice check at the end of the year, that's all good and fine. But I have one more request. Have a tzedakah box in your office or your home, and have a habit every morning to take a nickel or a quarter or whatever coin you choose and put it into the tzedakah box on a regular basis. What's the advantage of that? Let's say it's even much less than what you give every year for charity. So what's the benefit of that? It says it trains us to be givers. It trains us to be charitable. That by habit, before we start the davening, and we read it in today's Hayom Yom, by the way, which is a book that we read every day, that Rabbi Lazar was a very famous Talmudic scholar. Before he would pray in the morning, he would look for a poor person and give them a coin. Please mute yourself, whoever is laughing. Just please mute yourself. So the idea is that it makes us into givers. It's a habitual thing. When you do a mitzvah every day, it actually refines our character. So even furthermore, what if somebody has an inherent disposition because of their character flaw or because of their upbringing, and they are on an extreme level? The Rambam writes, for instance, that even though we should always be in the middle of the road, but there are two areas that one needs to be in the extreme. What are the two areas? Can anyone guess? Which two character traits do we go to the other extreme?
Anger.
Correct. Anger. If one has a tendency to get angry very quickly, they need to go to the other extreme to prevent themselves from becoming angry. And they have to try any kind of method that comes to mind. There was a rabbi that knew that he had that tendency, so he made a deal with himself that he will never get angry unless he wears a special white apron. The problem was that he used to hide the apron in such a way that he could never find it. So but he kept to the deal, so he never got angry because he couldn't find the white apron. But that was a gimmick that he used. But the point of the matter is that that's one of the characteristics where we have to go to the extreme. One other one is humility, or the opposite of humility. If somebody is an egotist or pompous, and it's in Hebrew, it's called gaiva. They're always self-aggrandizing, they're always promoting themselves, and it's always about themselves. They have to go to the opposite extreme in being extremely humble, even if it's very costly, and even if someone says negative things about them, it's better for them to be humble and absorb all of the insults than allowing themselves to be pompous. So here's where the Rambam writes it on same page 149, 3b. And he says the following: if you are already swayed to one extreme, distance yourself from it by moving to the opposite extreme and accustom yourself to it for a long time. There's a story, there's actually a video on GEM, on Jewish Education Media, but I didn't add the video because it's a very long one, so I'll give you the gist of it. The gist of it is the following. There was a guy by the name of Meshulam Weiss. This was in the 50s. And he got engaged to get married. And the custom was that the groom and the bride would go into the Rebbe a week before the wedding to receive the Rebbe's blessing. They had a private audience. They would go in together and go out together. So he said he didn't know anything. They made an appointment. They went in, and the Rebbe gave them a blessing and told them what they should do on the day of the wedding, some mitzvahs that they should do. Usually he would tell them that they should give extra tzedakah, the bride should read some Tillim, and the groom should study Torah. Then all of a sudden, the bride turns to the Rebbe and says, I would like to ask you a favor. I would like to speak to you privately without my groom, without the chassan. Can he please leave the room? Well, the groom was shocked. He didn't expect it. And the Rebbe looked up at him, so he realized that he has to go out. So he walked out. my father was standing, because my father was the one that arranged all the appointments. He says, what's going on? Usually you go in together, you go out together. He says, she had a special request. She said, okay. She was there for another 15 minutes. She came out and she was very emotional. And they didn't have a chance to exchange because the families were in a rush to get back to make the wedding arrangements. And in the custom of Orthodox, the bride and groom rarely speak on the week of the wedding. They speak a lot before, and then they get married until the Badekanish. So his first opportunity to speak to his bride was after the chuppah, when they went into the yichud room. And guess what? The first question, they just got married. He says, what happened that you were in the Rebbe's room for 15 minutes alone? What went on there? So she said, I told the Rebbe that I don't think I'm ready to get married. The Rebbe said, why? She said, because I have a temper. I get angry very quickly. Now, my groom has never seen it, but now that we're going to be together, he's going to see it. And it's going to hurt him a lot, and it's going to hurt our marriage. I'd rather not do it. So the Rebbe smiled and he said, you will be blessed with kids. You will learn how to hold your anger in. But he said, meanwhile, volunteer in a hospital, work in a hospital, and learn patience from the patients in the hospital. You'll have to deal with the patients. You will learn how to hold yourself back. And that's what she did. And it changed her character. So it's a story again that if we continue a certain behavior, it actually is able to reach into our character. There's another story here, but I don't feel comfortable reading it because it grossed me out. You can read it on your own, but I have a better story of that. So I'll tell you the story that's in the footnote than the story about the carcass, okay? So it's on page 150. So there were two people from Odessa. Does anyone know where Odessa is? It's not in the text, so you don't have to look at it. Odessa is in what country? The Ukraine. Odessa was a very big Jewish community, had a very Jewish community. And two men from Odessa traveled to see their Rebbe. The first one entered and shared a tale of vibrant life in Odessa. He said everybody is studying Torah and people are coming to synagogue and they're involved and everybody is celebrating with each other. He gave him just a very good report. The Rebbe was so happy that he gave him a gold coin as a gift for giving him the good report. The second man walked in from Odessa and he had a negative attitude. The city is a horrible city. People are ignoramuses there. They barely are able to get a minyan. It's like people describing Charlotte. You know, some people love Charlotte, and some people say they hate Charlotte. There's nothing really here. And the Rebbe gave him nothing. So he said, why did you give me nothing? I gave you an honest and true report. So the Rebbe said, I know what goes on in Odessa. The real question is, in which Odessa do you live in? In other words, we can always be in a place and we can see either the positive or we can see the negative. We have to train ourselves to see the positive. The story that grossed me out has the same concept, except the item that they use is not something that I feel comfortable talking about. But the point of the matter is the same. The idea is we can always see the negative in something, and it's our mission to actually see the positive. I have to say there's a book called Positivity Bias that was printed a number of years ago by Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson from England, and it's based on the Rebbe's talks and stories. But in the introduction, he says that the Rebbe himself spoke to one of his confidants, and he said, I had every reason to have a negative bias. I had every reason. I grew up in the Ukraine. I saw the pogroms against the Jews. I saw people being lost in war. His father was exiled for rabbinics. His father and mother couldn't even come to his wedding. And they were childless. He had every reason why he would be negative. And he said, I made a decision. I will not be able to get through life this way. I won't be able to get through life with a negative attitude. So I decided, he said it was hard work, but I decided that in every situation I should find the positive and I should focus on the positive. So this is the first area of how we train ourselves. Now, here we're going to see an example from the Talmud. Now, I must say something about the Talmud as a little introduction. You know, we think about the Talmud as a great repository of Jewish law, and you have all these arguments that put lawyers to shame because it goes to the last iota, it goes to the last thing. What was this? What was that? But sometimes you find bizarre tales in the Talmud. Now you have to remember the Talmud, and those that joined the JLI Talmud class know, was redacted many, many times. It was a period of 400 years that the Talmud was written, and the final edition was redacted by the great rabbis. They took out things and left things there. So if they left something in there, it was for a specific reason. It was to teach us a lesson. So we're going to find several stories from the Talmud in this lesson here, which on the surface, we don't know why it's mentioned, but if we analyze it, we'll see it's talking to our issue. So let's give a look here. We can either dwell in the positive and augment the positive, or we could live in the negative. Please turn to page 152. This is from the Talmud Brachot, which is the first tractate of the Talmud. So it's speaking about a great scholar from the Mishnah. His name is Ben Zoma. He's mentioned in the Pirkei Avot as well. And it says, he would say, what does a good guest say? Now, let me just set the scene. Two people were invited by a host for a great dinner. They both were there at the same time. They ate the same food. They had the same company. And they both came out with two opposite reactions. Let's see what the reactions are. So the first one, the Talmud labels as a good guest. So he says the following: my host extended himself remarkably for me. Look how much meat he brought before me, how much wine he set before me, how many fine rolls he laid out before me. My host did this all just for me. What did the bad guest say? Can I consider this host as having extended himself for me? All I ate was one piece of bread. I ate just one slice. I drank just one cup. If this host exerted himself, it was only for his own wife and children. So what are we talking about? They ate the same meal, and yet the first one is talking so positively of what the host did, and the second one, not so. How would you interpret it? Can anyone take a stab at this? Why would one host say that it was so great and the other host would say it was nothing? There was nothing different in practice. They ate the same food.
Choose to see the good in the situation and appreciate their children.
Whether you see the good, if you want to see the good, or if you don't want to see the good. So let's look. The first guy is so excited that they put themselves out.
Right.
They made a beautiful meal. And even it doesn't speak about himself, what he ate and what he didn't eat. That's irrelevant. What's relevant is what the host did. The second guy is focused on himself, not what the host did, right?
Right.
Sometimes you find I had a situation. In our house, we don't make big dinners at all. So we eat very little. My wife and I, whatever we find in the fridge, we eat. Dinner is not the big thing, unless it's hungry or whatever. So one time we had some guests that came, and our youngest son was there, and he wasn't using his filters then. So in the middle, he says to the guests, by the way, we never get such dinners. It's only because of you.
Ah,
And I have to say that according to this Talmudic study, he actually praised us because we did it for the guests. So a good guest says, you know, people don't usually go all out to have nice meat and nice wine and nice bread. It doesn't make a difference what I ate if I was hungry or not. It was just a very nice meal. And you can go to a banquet where they serve delicious food, but you're not that hungry or you don't want to stuff yourself. So you eat a little bit, but you still walk away and say there was a great banquet. But if someone is just focused on themselves with their animal soul, they're not thinking about what the other person put out for them. They're only thinking about themselves. So give a look even in the language. the first person says, look what the host put out. The host put out so much food, so much meat, and so much delicious wine, and so many rolls. The second guy doesn't even mention what kind of food it was. It just says, I only ate one piece of bread. It was just one slice, and I drank one cup. Doesn't even say what it was because the food was irrelevant. All it was the criticism.
Okay.
So what we see from this is the second person that's the bad guest is not a malicious person. They're just focused on themselves. Let's give a look what the Talmud continues. The Talmud says, with regard to the good guest, the verse proclaims, he remembers to augment what was done, singing people's praises. This is taken from the book of Job. With regard to the bad guest, it is stated, people therefore fear him. The person is only considering themselves. So what does this mean? It means that in everything we have a choice in how to react and how to perceive, and it goes to the training. Salespeople always tell the story that there was a shoe manufacturer that put out some very good, comfortable shoes that everybody should like, and they had two new salesmen, and they sent them to a town that they had never done business there. And this was in the days when you communicated with telegrams. Let's say they communicated with text. So the first guy sends a text back, I'm sending you all the shoes that you pre-ordered and delivered. There's no need for it. Everybody walks barefoot, so you're not going to sell any shoes. Second salesman says, send more. We have such an opportunity. The entire city is barefoot. Look how many shoes we sell. So it's the difference of an attitude. There's either an attitude where it's gloom and doom, and if people before me couldn't convince them to wear shoes, how am I going to do it? Right? The founder of Apple, Steve Jobs, never thought about it because he was creating products that nobody thought they would need. But he created products that he also created a desire with it, that in this desire, people came out and they decided that they need it. So it's all about how we approach something. So what do we learn over here? What we learn over here is that how to overcome negativity bias is called self-training. We need to focus on the positive. We need to train ourselves how to look at the positive. And even though the temptation is there to look at the negative and see a person in a negative and say, you know, they're doing it for an ulterior motive. The reason that they gave tzedakah is because they want the picture in their paper. The reason that they made such a nice meal is because they wanted to impress their family. It happens to be that it was nice to impress the family that they had a guest, therefore I'm there. So those kinds of thoughts are very negative thoughts. And it doesn't mean that they're not real. It could be that it's real, but it's not our job to think that way. Our job is to think positive. We will talk in the next lesson that it's inevitable that you meet people that are really negative and people that have true negative traits. And what can we do to help them? But sometimes the negative traits can be also circumstantial. We're going to see a story, but this story is not in the text. We had Label Wolf here once from Australia, who's a mystical philosopher. He spoke here in Charlotte, and one of the things he was trying to say is about attitude. So he tells the story, and I've told it a few times, so I beg forgiveness if you already heard it, that there was a man driving on a remote mountain road that there was barely room for one car, and it was switchblades. You know, they were going back and forth. He was going up, and if he would have made a little wrong turn, the car can fly off the cliff. And all of a sudden, there's a car coming towards him with a young lady, and her windows are rolled down, and she came down in a way that she swerved, that he thought she was swerving right into him. And to add salt to the wounds, as she passed him, she yelled out at him in the loudest voice, "Pig!" He got so angry. How could she do that? Not only did she almost get me off the road, but she insulted me. When all of a sudden, when he turned, he saw a wild pig running in the road. And he realized that she swerved was because the pig forced her to swerve, and she was actually warning him
Right.
to be careful, right? So what is the meaning of that? The meaning of that is that sometimes what happens is most times we use our default, which is the negative. So
Right.
therefore, we judge everything in the negative. Sometimes we're lucky enough to see the positive. So not every event that you see should be interpreted as a negative or with suspicion. So why do we do it with suspicion? Because the animal soul is all about self-preservation. Self-preservation is also has an element of self-protection. And self-protection is we don't want to fall as a fool and trust the other person when they will take advantage of us or be fooled to think that they're truly good. So therefore, the default operating system tells us be cautious. I'll tell you a funny story. This was in 2003. I was sitting in my office, and it was before Rosh Hashanah. It was a very busy time. And our secretary, Brenda Waxman, comes into my office, and she says, I don't know if it's a prank or not, but there's a lady by the name of Jackie, and she says she's calling from the White House, and she wants to speak to you. Probably a prank. So I said, you know what? Even if it's a prank, let me find out what it is. So she says, I'm from the White House, and the president is going to be meeting with a group of rabbis, and your name came up as one of the rabbis that are going to be there. They had some sort of lottery, she said. So I need you to send in your Social Security and, other documents. And I said, who am I sending to? She said, Jackie at whitehouse.gov. But she said, Jackie at whitehouse.gov. There was another website, whitehouse.com, which was not a nice one. But
Right,
whitehouse.gov, I knew was the White House.
Right.
So I said, okay. She gave me the date and all of that. Hung up the phone, and I called the Chabad rabbi in Washington, D.C. That's the liaison between Chabad and the White House. He's a cousin of my wife, cousin of my Yashi. So he answered the phone right away. And I said, I got a phone call from the White House. He says, oh my, I forgot to tell you, you were chosen to be there and I was distracted. It's genuine, it's real. But why was my first reaction that it's probably a prank? Because we want to protect ourselves. We
Right.
don't want to be taken advantage of, right? So what happens is that when we see somebody else doing good, or we see a positive trait in someone, we always look at it with suspicion. And because we look at it as suspicion, therefore we judge them. But the reality is that it's very possible that the person is actually good. Give them the benefit of the doubt. Doesn't mean that you should let your guard down. It doesn't mean that we should become a fool and be taken advantage of, but we can definitely train ourselves that when somebody comes to us with a gift or does something nice, they really mean it. They're not trying to buy our favor or buy our kindness. So here's a more dramatic story, which this deals with the FAE that we talked about before. And how do we get out of the error? So this is a very difficult story it's not a gross story, but it's a very difficult story. But nevertheless, it's important. And again, the Talmud puts it in because it's trying to teach us a lesson. It's trying to teach us how to instill within us the positivity. So this is taken from a different tractate. It's the Tractate of Shabbat, text 6a. We're not going to read the whole story in one shot because there's places we have to stop. Just to give you a little introduction, in the olden days, there were people that used to hire themselves out for many years, and then they would get the salary when they finished their work. But while they were working, the ones that they worked for were obligated to feed them and give them spending money for clothes, give them lodging and all of that. So they were taken care of, but the salary could be given after 3 years. And this is the story that we find here. A fellow once traveled, this is in Israel, obviously. A fellow once traveled south from the Upper Galilee. The Upper Galilee, you all know where that is, northern Israel, and was hired by a landowner for a 3-year term. This was in the south of Israel. South of Israel is like Beersheba, Kiryat Gat, that's called the south of Israel. He was there for 3 years. The end of the 3 years, it was the eve of Yom Kippur. The Galilean asked his employer, give me my wages so I can go and feed my family and children. The employer replied, I have no money. The employee rejoined, in that case, give me my wages in the form of produce, to which the employer insisted he had none. Give me my wages in the form of land, he pressed, but the employer replied he owned no land. Give me animals, I have none. Give me cushions and blankets, I have none. The worker slung his tools over his shoulder and left for home in anguish. Let's stop here. What would a typical employee say if they worked hard and honestly for 3 years, expecting to be compensated with a decent salary? Yeah, they were fed and they were given lodging, but that wasn't the main salary. And all of a sudden, the employer says no. Not only that, they saw that the employer was a wealthy man. He ate nice meals, he had nice wagons, not nice cars, but he had a nice house, he had everything nice, and all of a sudden, no. What do you think the reaction would be from the average worker?
Quit. But they would quit.
Well, the quitting is not the issue because he was finished with his term.
Oh.
What would be the reaction in his mind? What would he say?
Anger.
Anger.
Right.
And he would say, what?
Heated, right?
You're a thief. He
Right.
would say, you're immoral. You're a miser, right?
Right.
But it doesn't say that in the Talmud. It just says the Talmud slung his tools over his shoulder and he walked in anger. Now, Yom Kippur, the day before Yom Kippur is a very busy day. After Yom Kippur is busy because we go into the holiday of Sukkot. The Sukkot is called the festival, okay? And the festival, we don't work, we don't travel, unless somebody was in Jerusalem. So after the festival, text 6b, the employer took the worker's wages in his hands and set off for the worker's home. He took 3 donkeys, the first laden with food, the second with beverages, and the third with assorted delicacies. And he visited this employee. After they ate and drank together, the employer handed him his wages. The employer then asked the Galilean, tell me, when you requested your wages and I replied I had no money, what did you suspect? Responded the employee, I told myself perhaps the opportunity to purchase merchandise inexpensively had just presented itself. It was Black Friday. And you purchased it with money you had and you had no money available. And when you requested animals and I said I had none, what did you suspect? Replied the employee, I told myself that perhaps the animals are rented to others. When you asked for land and I claimed to own no land, what did you suspect? Perhaps the land is leased to others. And when you asked for produce and I said I had none, what did you suspect? Perhaps they were not tithed. Now, just let me stop here for a second. Tithing of produce in Israel is a very serious issue. The Torah prohibits us from eating untithed fruit. So let's say if you have fruits, you have 10 bushels of oranges, you have to take 1 bushel of orange and give it to the Levi. You can't, first you give the truma, then you give the tithing. If you don't give the tithing, then the rest of the produce is prohibited to eat. I give you an example. I once walked into Harris Teeter here in Charlotte, and they had these big cartons with delicious Jaffa oranges, and on the box was an OU, indicating that they're kosher. So I had some smart guy that came to me and said, oranges have to be kosher? So I said, oranges are naturally kosher, but let's see where it's from. Sure enough, it said it's produce from Israel. So I said, if it's produce from Israel, there has to be rabbinic supervision that the tithing actually took place. Otherwise, you can't eat. When you buy a bottle of wine from Israel and it has a kosher supervision, not all wine from Israel is kosher. If you go to the local stores for Israeli wine, you have to make sure if you want to drink kosher wine, which I recommend that you should, it has to have a kosher supervision. And if you look at the Hebrew, it says, hufrash masrot v'trumot. In other words, that the tithing was actually separated. Now, tithing is not an easy thing. Most people don't know how to tithe. You have to train how to do it. I remember once traveling in Israel and we were hungry and we bought some oranges and I was with a Jerusalem man. He said, hold on a second, I will tithe it. And he did the whole tithing and he did the whole blessing. And then we were able to eat the oranges. So generally, if someone doesn't have it, someone that owns the fruit and they don't know how to tithe, they need to go to the rabbi and ask them to tithe. That's why he says, perhaps they were not tithed, you couldn't give me the fruits. When I insisted that I had owned no cushions or blankets, what did you suspect? Perhaps he consecrated all his property to heaven. Okay, let me give you this law, and then we'll give you the analysis, and then we'll give you the end of the story, which is on page 160. So, what's the story of consecration? It's called in Hebrew hektish. One has a right to take any item of property and say they're giving it for holy purposes, that it has to go to the Beit HaMikdash. Once it goes to the Beit HaMikdash, even if it doesn't transfer the property, but you say, this computer has now become hektish, it's the property of the Beit HaMikdash, you're not allowed to use it. It can only be used in the Beit HaMikdash for holy things. Or if you pick up a table and say, this is hektish, nobody can use it. Now, he said, maybe you consecrated everything. The truth of the matter is, the Talmud is not trying to say that the owner here was right. Because when you hire an employee, you have to make sure you have the money set aside to pay them. And you can't use all these excuses to say, oh, I consecrated, or I didn't have it, or I sold it. You can't say that. But the Talmud is trying to illustrate a point over here. Not only that, it actually says that one is prohibited from sanctifying all of their possessions, because then they become dependent on others. It's just like the halacha that one is not allowed to give all their money that they have to tzedakah, because then they cannot take care of themselves. The Talmud goes further and says that a person, when they give tzedakah, should not give more than 20% of their earnings to tzedakah, unless their name is Bill Gates. But ordinary people are not allowed to do that. Why? Because then they might become a burden on the community. Every community needed to have a communal fund where people would give charity to, and that communal fund was supposed to take care of the poor, that those people that didn't have money on their own, and they couldn't buy meals and they couldn't buy clothes, that they had to be taken care of. And actually, these communal funds exist today. The Rambam writes that one is not permitted to live in a city where you don't have a community fund, a community charity. It could be here as the Federation. In other places, they have organizations that they raise money, and they know families that are in distress, that before the holidays or before Shabbat, they get them food, they get them clothes, they get them money, they get them whatever they need. So one is not supposed to do that, but that's not what the purpose of the story is. The purpose of the story over here is to say, how to teach us how did this employee who worked hard for 3 years react to the fact that all of a sudden he thought he might not get paid. The end of the story is on page 160, text 6c. The Talmud says there, the employer exclaimed, I swear that it was so. I had made a vow concerning all my property, consecrating it to the temple. Now, why did he do this? He did it because I was upset that my son Hyrcanus, I was upset at my son Hyrcanus for not engaging in Torah study, and I sought to disinherit him. In other words, you can have a parent that gets so angry at their child because their child, who was an only child, didn't walk in their footsteps, didn't do what they want. So I say, I'm cutting you out of my inheritance. And in order to cut you out of my inheritance, I give everything away to charity. Now you're not going to have anything. Now see. And then he realized that he made a mistake. According to halacha, you're not supposed to do that. Now, even though you're not allowed to do it, but if you do it, it's still a valid pledge. And now he can't use any of his money. It doesn't belong to him anymore. So what he has to do is annul his vows. Annulling of the vows is something that the Torah teaches. And what's the idea of annulment of vows? You have to go in front of at least 3 people, or sometimes 10 people, but they understand the laws of vows, and they ask you, why do you want to, what was your vow? Why did you want to annul it? Why do you want to annul the vow? And you say, because I can't live with it. The vow is too restricting. So then they have the right to nullify the vow. In fact, it's interesting because it says that it was before Yom Kippur. The big prayer on the night of Yom Kippur is the annulment of the vows, Kol Nidre. From here we learn that Kol Nidre was not yet composed in the time of the Talmud. Otherwise, he would have done Kol Nidre. He would have no problem. What did he have to do? He had to go to the rabbis in his neighborhoods. He says, when I came to the sages of the south, there were sages of the north. They were all categorized, the sages of the north, the sages of the south. We find it by Alexander of Macedonia that he visited each group. So it says that he had a whole dialogue with the sages of the south. They released all my vows. And so when you came to me, I had given everything away. So I had to say, I don't have it. It was not mine. But once after the holiday, I was able to annul my vows. Now I can pay. And I paid you. As for you, just as you judged me favorably, so may God judge you favorably. Which is a very interesting blessing, because we ask God to please look into our hearts, that even though we made mistakes and we gave into temptations, but not always can we fight it. The very famous Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev said that if God was there in the revealed form and all the temptations were in a book, then it would be easy to have a godly life, because what's tangible is godliness. Well, what does God do? God makes all the temptations tangible, and himself he puts into the books. So then he says, okay, give in to temptations. So Rabbi Levi Yitzchak was saying to God, how can you have complaints against other people? So this is the idea of judging us favorably. So what is the Talmudic study? What is this Talmudic story trying to teach us? Now, the sages that came after the Talmud did a lot of research to figure out who this employee was, because this employee was very saintly. It's not normal that you have somebody that worked for 3 years and they're so easy going that they could judge their employer in such a favorable way. And many opinions say that it was Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva did not become a scholar till he was 40. And as a younger man, he was a shepherd and he worked in different places. And the reason they say that they have evidence that it was Rabbi Akiva, but knowing Rabbi Akiva's character and how he worked on himself, he was so refined that Rabbi Akiva, even though he wasn't a scholar, was a very, very noble person. That's why he was a shepherd for a very rich man, one of the richest people in Israel, whose name was Gurion, not Ben Gurion, but Gurion. And he was from noble aristocracy, and a shepherd was a blue-collar guy. And this noble man's daughter, who was very educated herself, and she was very with it and cool and mainstream in every which way, she fell in love with the shepherd. And when she came to her father to say, I'm going to marry the shepherd, the father became so distraught that he threw her out of the house. And she stuck with Rabbi Akiva, and she saw the nobility, she saw the refined character, but she also saw his intellectual ability. So she encouraged him to go to school. And when he came back with 24,000 students and everybody was crowding around him, he said, let my wife come on the stage. And he said, it is in her merit that I am who I am, because she was able to see the potential. So they say this employee was Rabbi Akiva. They also say that the father-in-law later tried to win him back, but that's not the main part of the story. So what do we see over here? We see over here that the stories are a little bit extreme, and they are also not according to the idea of Jewish behavior, of making vows, of giving everything away. But so important was this message to put into the Talmud to teach us at least how to modify our behavior and to be able, even though we want to preserve ourselves and protect ourselves, but also how to respect others and see perhaps there is something there. Now, you can ask, why didn't the employer say, I'm sorry, I gave everything away and therefore I can't give it to you? Because who says the person would believe him? He was just quiet because he knew in his mind that he wants to annul the vow, but he couldn't do it on the day before Yom Kippur. He had to wait until after the holidays that he can travel to the city where the sages were. But at the same time, this employee showed a tremendous amount of respect to his employer. So it's a hard thing, but there is an exercise here on page 161 where you have different kinds of relationships, whether it's intimacy, friendship, participation, or exchange. Have a scenario where you think that somebody wronged you and give a look to see whether it's a personality attribution. Is that the character flaw in the person, that the person is always mistreating people? Or perhaps it's a circumstantial attribution. Like the girl shouting pig. She meant no harm. Actually, she was trying to save the guy from falling off the cliff and being careful from not crashing into an animal and then, God forbid, dying. So he took it as a negative when she meant it as a positive. So a lot of times there are things that happen and it's all subject to our interpretation, how we interpret. Thanksgiving was a very high travel time.
Yeah.
I have a friend of mine, this was years ago, that he was standing in line at the airline desk and there were flights that were canceled and changed. Passengers were irate.
All
They
right.
were tired, they were hungry, they wanted to get back home, and they let out all their anger and frustration on the desk agents. And the desk agents tried to smile and they were exhausted. Some of them sounded nasty because they really couldn't do anything. So what did he do? He went over to the Starbucks and he bought a whole bunch of gift cards,
Oh,
$5 gift cards. And then he came back to the desk. First, he gave all the agents a gift, and then he started giving all the passengers a gift. And all of a sudden, the mood changed.
Hmm.
Everybody calmed down. And he said, listen, it's a weather event. There's nothing you can do about it. Just we'll do the best we can. And nobody's trying to get you. So he had the foresight to be able to tap into the energy that was there and say, what can I do to be able to make the mood a little better? So it cost him $500 or it cost him $1,000. It was still worth it for him because look at the benefit that he got out of it. So what I'm saying is that we sometimes get caught up in the moment. And another example, we're gonna get to the last part in a minute. Another example is that you sometimes have people that their behavior is consistent with people that are on the spectrum. And people that are on the spectrum don't have empathy. They don't understand what empathy is, but they do have jobs. And sometimes they'll say something that'll sound very nasty, and we get very put off by that, not realizing that they can barely manage keeping a job down because they have difficult issues with themselves. So it teaches us to be kind with them. Now we're going to go to one more thing. This is the inner part. There's a very famous Mishnah in Avot. I have it up on the screen. And it says the following: Va'al todin et chavercha at shetegia lemkomo. Do not judge others until you've reached their place. What does that mean? It's actually one of the Polish rebbes said, guess what? You're never going to reach his place. Why is he saying that? You don't want to reach the place. Because if someone is acting out something which is negative, you don't know what the underlying cause for that is. Okay? Steve Covey, I wasn't planning to say it, but I'll mention it anyways. He writes in his books, he wrote the book, The 7 Habits That Make You Greater, From Good to Great, or whatever. So he tells a story. It's a story that's very powerful. And he was once working very hard on a presentation in college, at City College in New York. And he was very preoccupied with it. And he worked many days. And then he lived in Manhattan. And to get to work, he had to take the subway. So he goes onto the subway. And the second stop after his stop, a man comes with several children, 4 children, 5 children. And the man sits down and he's totally oblivious to what's going on. And his kids begin to jump all over the place, banging into people, screaming and knocking things out. And they're just bouncing. And he's getting very angry. And he says, can't you control your kids? This is what he's saying in his mind.
Mhm.
And it builds to a crescendo that after several stops, it's really intolerable. And finally, he goes over to the man and he says, "Sir, do you see the way your kids are behaving?" He looks up from a trance. He looks around and he says, "Yeah, we're just coming from the hospital where their mother just died."
Oh,
In that second, he had a paradigm shift. Until then, he was being judgmental. This is an uncaring father. And the father says, "I don't even have the money to bury her. I don't even know how I'm going to take care and go to work and find a babysitter." And he bursts out crying. He felt so bad that he misjudged the situation and didn't realize that it wasn't a character flaw. This was what we call situational behavior. That he took down the man's phone number and address, and he said, "We'll be in touch." And he started a fund in the college to help this man. And they raised a lot of money and took care of them. So what am I trying to say? Sometimes we see bad behavior in a person, and we don't know where it's coming from. Now, this is what it means. You don't want to reach that place. You don't want to be in a place where you suffer a tragedy and then you can't deal with it. But don't judge them until you come to the tragedy. Now, there are all kinds of animals roaming the world. So within us, we also have all kinds of animal souls. The Rebbe Rashab, the fifth Chabad Rebbe, said, "I feel like a farmer because some of the people, my students, act like an ox and a bull. And they're very angry and charging at each other. Some are very passive like a lamb. Everybody has their challenge." So the Rebbe, first let's see what the Alter Rebbe says. The Alter Rebbe says the following. Rabbi Shneur Zalman Levadi in Tanya chapter 30. He takes this passage and he says, "Do not judge others until you have reached their place. This is because their place, that is their environment, causes them to engage in undesirable behavior. Their livelihood requires of them to navigate the marketplace all day and to linger at the street corners. Thus their eyes witness all temptations, and what the eye sees, the heart desires." So that's one thing. He says it's an environmental thing. Sometimes people are plucked into an environment which the environment is conducive to all kinds of negative things. And it's a wonder that they're not worse. Like the guy at the funeral said, "The praise I have is that his brother was worse." This guy is not even worse. Okay. Additionally, he says, the nature of their instinctive impulse leads them to undesirable action, for it burns in them like a baker's fiery oven. The instinctive impulse is not the same in everyone. So what does this mean? There are different people. The Alter Rebbe says furthermore, there's some people that their impulse is so strong that they can be impulsive to do all kinds of crazy things if the environment allows for it. What he says is go out of that environment, minimize, find ways to stop it. Says there are some people that have no temptations. They're very apathetic about anything. So they have to work on the opposite to get themselves a little bit excited. But nevertheless, it means to say, yeah, if you see someone that has a problem or they give into temptation, as we're going to learn in lesson 5 or 6, we need to do what we can to help them. No question about that. But we don't have to be judgmental of them. It's possible. Think about it this way. What would be with us if we were in that situation? What happens if the only job we can get is a job to be in a place where the environment is an environment that leads to all kinds of temptations? How long would it take for us to fall into that place? And, we say this to the youth about peer pressure. There was a malady in my day that young people, teenagers, they were 17, 18, or 19, they didn't take drugs. There were some that did, but they would smoke cigarettes. And I asked them, where did you get the temptation to smoking? Because the other one smoked. Where did you get it? The other one smoked. There was some middle-aged people that smoked because at that time, smoking wasn't as taboo as it is today. But, all you had was people smoking. And unfortunately, even in the religious community, smoking was very popular, even in Israel. In fact, in Israel, it was worse than in other places. They used to joke that babies are born and they get the first gift, a pack of cigarettes, because
Oh.
everybody smoked. So it's an environmental thing. Actually, the tobacco companies were very guilty because Orthodox Jews would not smoke Friday night and Shabbat or on Rosh Hashanah. So you know what the Dubek was the name of the tobacco company. So they had little sample packages with fresh cigarettes, maybe 2 or 3 cigarettes in a little pack. And every Friday, they would have it sent to all the synagogues around the country. So immediately after Shabbat, everybody got a free sample of a cigarette. Get a free cigarette, you start smoking. So this is an environmental thing that was conducive. Today, you're not allowed to do it. Today, it's prohibited and they would be fined. But nevertheless, it's an example. So before we judge someone else, say to ourselves, what would we do if we were in that situation? So that's another way of helping ourselves in seeing who we are and what we are. Now, we're going to go to something else. Before we go, let's just look at the board. Summary. Dwell on the virtues. Remember, we say focus on the positive. Don't focus on the negative. See the benefits, just like the guy that was the guest, and he said it was a fantastic dinner. There was so much good food there, and it was so gracious. And when you do see a failing, try to contribute it to the unique circumstances and think to yourself, if you were in their position, would you do the same or not? Now we're going to come to the final part, which is the philosophy. So in order to get to the philosophy, we have a nice poem. Open up to page 165. It's written by Shel Silverstein. It's called Zebra Question. It was published in a book titled A Light in the Attic. And this poem speaks for itself. It's called the Zebra Poem. I asked the zebra, are you black with white stripes or white with black stripes? And the zebra asked me, are you good with bad habits or are you bad with good habits? Are you noisy with quiet times or are you quiet with noisy times? Are you happy with some sad days or are you sad with some happy days? Are you neat with some sloppy ways or are you sloppy with some neat ways? And on and on and on and on and on and on he went. Guess what? I'll never ask the zebra about stripes again. But if you think about it, the question is, who is the real us? There's part of our identity that aspires for altruism and kindness and spirituality. But then there's part of us that's governed by our selfishness and instincts that are hedonistic, that are not exactly the best, right? This is where we go back to the first lesson when we talked about the 2 souls. We have the animal soul and we have the divine soul. And by the way, it saved a lot of people from taking medicine because a lot of people thought that they were schizophrenic or they thought that they had dual personality. Because when they're in a spiritual environment, in a godly environment, they want to learn more Torah, they want to be more spiritual, and they want to have a connection to God. When they go into a very materialistic environment, they want to be more material, they want to be more physical and more into what their needs are. And many of them wrote to the Rabbi Shneur Zalman Liadi, are we crazy? I mean, either we want the spiritual stuff or we want the material stuff. He says, you're not crazy, but you have the 2 souls within you. This is actually taken from last week's Torah portion. Rivka, the second of the matriarchs, was pregnant and she felt her sons fighting with each other. The Medrash says when she passed a house of ill repute, she felt as if one of the babies wanted to get out and join the party. When she passed the house of Shem and Ever where they were studying, she felt like the baby wanted to go out and be studious. So she goes to God and God says, you have 2 great nations within you. So Hasidic philosophy says that this is also an indication to the 2 souls that's within each and every one of us. We have the animal soul, which is the part of us that wants the temptations, but we also have the divine soul, which is the part of us that wants the spirituality, and it's up to us to decide who's going to dominate, right? So which is the real you? Now, if you remember in the first class, we asked the same question, who's the real you? And we use the quote from the morning service where it says, "My Lord, the soul that you have inserted within me is pure." So the me is not pure and holy. The me is animalistic, but in the animal you put in the soul. Here we're going to learn that the opposite is the truth. And how do we know that? So we find that the human being was created very different than any other material or spiritual entity, where we were created from dual components. Our bodies were made from the earth, and our souls were made from God's breath. And yet, about us, it says that God wanted us to be created in the image of God and in the form of God, even though God has no image and has no form, but it's in the way God displays and manifests his divinity into the world. So we are created in the divine image. That's why when you look at another human being, you have to see the soul, which is the candle of God. So let's see what it says in text 9. God said, "Let us make humankind in our image and in our likeness." So even though there's an animal part, but that animal part is not the real who we are. The real who we are is that we're created in the image of God. We're created, and the divine soul really has to dominate. Now, why is this important? You know why this is important? I hate that you're blind. So what's the divine? I know 2 weeks ago you said you had too much growing up, but it's okay. You'll have a little bit of me at least at the end.
You just went out of the frame, Rabbi.
I'll turn the camera. Am I in the frame now?
Yes.
Okay. So here we go. When God created the human being, God created the human being in a way that the divine can dominate over the animal soul. Why is this important? The reason it's important is the following. It's a very interesting concept. When somebody goes astray from the right path and they come back, they're called a Baal Tshuva. What does a Baal Tshuva mean? A master of return. What is the meaning of return? When we talk about Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur returning to God, so in the colloquial expression, they use the word repent. Repent means that we've become bad, and now we have to change our ways. We have to turn over a leaf, start a whole new life again. Part of it is true, but the truth of the matter is that it would be such an uphill battle, because try to take someone and change who they are and change not only their habits, but change their personality. Before they were very materialistic, and now you're making them very godly. Comes along the Torah and says, in essence, you're godly from the time of birth. And that's why it's returning to your true source of who you are. Because the inner source of who you are is the soul. And the same thing is true about the world. The Zohar says, in the name of the Medrash, that when God first created the world, the entire universe was filled with divine light, that it was the infinite light that was in the world, and then on the second day, God reduced it. Why is that important? Because when we bring light into the world, we're not bringing something new, we're bringing something that was already there. So the world is already predisposed to the light. The world is already trained and manufactured and created in such a way that it can absorb the light. It's just that it's hidden. Our job is to reveal more and more and more of it. So therefore, when we say that we look at a human being and we see that the human being has a divine soul in them, some people cause the divine soul should be obstructed. Some people cause that the divine soul should be suffering and suppressed. But basically, we have the ability to reveal that. That's divine spark. And when you see that, it comes out. And I'm going to give you another example because we only have one or two more texts to read, so I'm allowing myself to do that. So when the Rebbe came out with the mitzvah campaign that we talked about before, and one of them was the tzedakah, to give the charity every day and put it into a pushka. So the mitzvah campaign was interesting, how it was received. And there were people that criticized the Rebbe, especially in the Haredi community. You're making Judaism too easy. Just say you do a few mitzvahs, and with that you come back. You got to teach them the real stuff. They got to learn all the hard stuff. Now, the Rebbe didn't say that they shouldn't learn all the Torah, but he didn't say that you should only tell them that there are 10 mitzvahs. Tell everybody there's 613, but start with one of the 10 and then build it. So I remember the Rebbe spoke about it, and he said the following. He said, let's say you meet someone that has no connection to religious life. And they don't display any belief in God. They don't do any of the mitzvah. So you come to them and say, you're really a naughty human being. You're worthless. But if you want to have some value, follow me and I'll show you how to have value. So if the person is decent, they'll say, have a nice day. If they're not decent, they probably would say something nasty. Or you can come and say to them, you have treasures hidden within your soul. You have such hidden gifts that you don't even know, and I don't even know what you have. Come, let's explore it. By lighting a Shabbat candle, you'll find one gift. By putting on film, you'll find another gift. You're intriguing them. They're interested in doing that because that's who they truly are. So this is the idea that we have to look at another human being. We have to try to see the divine image. Let's give a look what it says in number 10. This is taken also from the Rebbe's talk. He says, the Rebbes of Chabad crafted an adage. Just as we need to know the shortcomings, so we need to know our advantages. Let me explain what that is. A lot of people say, if we want to be honest and we want to do a true reckoning of who we are, we need to recognize all of our faults. And the previous Rebbe said, it's nice to know faults, but that's not sufficient. You need to know what your virtues are as well. You need to know your strengths. Don't be too harsh on yourself. And by knowing your strengths, that'll help you overcome the faults. So here's how he explains it. Give a look inside. He says the anomaly in this phrase is that it refers to our advantages, whereas with regards to shortcomings, it merely refers to the shortcomings, not our shortcomings. The explanation, the Torah introduces its discussion of the atonement process with the words, if a soul sinned, right? If a soul sinned, they have to bring this particular offering. What does the Zohar say? Does anyone know what the Zohar says? Look inside. You have the page? Look inside. What does it say? The Zohar says, a soul sinned? Is that possible? In other words, the Zohar says it's not possible for a human being to sin. It's only that they forgot momentarily who they are, and therefore they sin. The concept of sin is completely alien to our being. Even when we stumble, God forbid, our lapse does not undermine our identity. Rather, it's something external to our nature that has latched onto us. Think about that in this way. I'm going to tell a private story that just happened last week when I was in Israel, and I'm going to ask my son forgiveness. So when you hear this, I was with Shmuley. I actually had him come with me to the Shiva and do all of that because he lives in Jerusalem. He had to have a blood test that day. And apparently the technician didn't know what she was doing. And when she put in the needle to get the thing going, she caused him to bleed, and it bled over his nice pants that he bought here in Charlotte. So he called me and he said, it's horrible. I'm going to have to throw out the pants. It has a blood stain, and I can't even find this in Israel. He was upset. So I said, look it up and see how you can clean it. And I said to him the following. I said, your pants are not defined by the stain. They're defined by the quality. The stain is something which came on, and you'll be able to get it out. It happens to be that he sent me a few minutes later another text that he found on Google that if you wash it in cold water and then you put a little detergent on it, the blood
Right.
goes out. So I had detergent with me and everything was fine. What was the lesson that we took out of it? The lesson you took out of it is the stain doesn't characterize the pants. The pants was very good quality pants that he got on sale and he really liked. It was comfortable. It was jeans or whatever it was. And that's the character of it. Why don't we do the same thing with a human being? So a human being has a flaw. They failed. Does that characterize who they are? It's a stain on them. So now we have to help them clean the stain and let the goodness shine out. And that's what the Rebbe is saying over here. And this brings us to really the end of this class. And it's a Mashiach idea. There's a very interesting thing in the Haftorah of Isaiah about Mashiach. I don't know how many of you remember that, but on the last day of Pesach in the diaspora, we read the portion of Isaiah that deals with the coming of Mashiach. And there's a very strange statement that it says there, that when Mashiach will judge people, he will not judge people based on what he sees with his eyes or what he hears testimony. Give a look what it says in Isaiah, page 168. In other words, he will not judge, neither with the sight of his eyes will he judge, nor with the hearing of his ears. What would he do? It says that he will have the sense of smell. It's a metaphor. By smelling you, he will know exactly what your character is. We're not talking about a physical aroma or odor or whatever kind of deodorant you used. It's speaking about a spiritual sense. It comes from the word reach, which is an example of spirituality. In your presence, he will know who you are. And that you won't have to say anything to them. Why is that? So the previous Rebbe explained something like this. 169, page 169, text 11b. Human judgment is confined to what eyes see and what the ears hear. We do not enter into the lives of the people being judged, nor do we consider their circumstances or their environment. We do not delve in their internal experience or explore the factors that led them to their current situation. This type of judgment is not true judgment. True judgment can only be given when we place ourselves in another situation and experience that which they experience. Regarding Mashiach, it is stated, neither with the sight of his eyes shall he judge, nor with the hearing of his ears shall he reprove. Mashiach's judgment would not be like the typical human judgment, based solely on what one sees and hears. Mashiach will understand and feel the circumstances that led wrongdoers to err. Mashiach will recognize that the wrongdoers did not want to stray, but simply could not overcome their passionate desires.
Oh.
This brings us to a statement that the previous Rebbe heard from his father. His father said he once, as a child, the previous Rebbe was with a friend, and his mother gave out watermelon. And the watermelon was really delicious, red. But she gave a much bigger piece to the friend and a smaller piece to him. What does a child do usually when they see that their sibling or friend got a bigger piece? Why does he get a bigger piece? You don't like me. You gave me a small piece. So the previous Rebbe said that his father said to him that the shin and a sin are the same letter. The only difference is that one has the eye on the right side and one has the eye on the left side. The right is kindness, the left is discipline. He says, always look at the other person with your right eye, with kindness. And this is what Mashiach does. I want to say personally, we experienced it with the Rebbe. When you stood in front of the Rebbe, it was like standing in front of a soul scanner. You couldn't hide. You were totally exposed. You saw everything about you. I remember when the Rebbe looked at me or looked at anyone with his penetrating eyes, it wasn't serious or angry. It was a very kind eyes, but you felt like you were totally exposed. You knew everything, and you saw it. I remember one time by Fabrengen, there was a yeshiva student that was pushing, and the Rebbe looked at him, and the Rebbe said, "Why are you pushing when you didn't even recite Tehillim this morning?" And how do I know that it's all over your face? I see that you didn't recite Tehillim this morning, or what you did last night. The Rebbe saw it. And yet, the Rebbe was very kind to each and every one of us. He accepted us for who we are. Even though he didn't accept himself at that level, he demanded from himself a schedule that was unbelievable, the amount of learning and piety that was unbelievable. But he was able to accept us because he knew that we had the challenges. And if you have the challenges and you have the faults, so for instance, we had a video that's a fantastic video that was shown at the banquet of the Shluchim conference, and that was when everybody became quiet. It was a story of a deaf young man who became a rabbi, and he found a mission in life to be able to be a rabbi to the deaf Jewish community in Israel. And he has 15,000 people that are deaf in Israel that are his congregants. And he communicates with them only through sign language. They love him, he loves them, and he has brought them such spirituality. So they had the video about him, of all of his work. And it was so powerful. And all of a sudden the light's on and he's standing in front at the podium. And he was speaking with sign language and you had somebody interpreting for the audience. So why did he get such attention? Because recognizing his situation and the circumstances with which he was born with, the expectations are very low. And yet he was able to build a fantastic organization to do such good. It really intrigued us. If we can only look at every person and say, the circumstances that this person has are ones that we don't understand, and yet they're able to pull off basically a positive life, even though from time to time they struggle, they fail, they do something nasty, but by and large, they're good people, and we should celebrate that and appreciate it. But what happens if you truly find someone that does have bad habits and someone that is a repeat offender and they can't help themselves? For that, stay tuned for next week. We'll give the advice of how we can influence them and engage them with kindness to help them change their ways. Thank you all. It's good to be back. Have a great night. Yeah, I don't like to miss JLI, but again, I apologize, but I'm sure you understand the circumstances. So I had to be there. It was my shortest trip to Israel ever. I arrived Tuesday morning and left Wednesday night. So
Oh, God.
Wow.
Lesson 4.
hey,
Ashikara.
very good.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Oh, thank you. It was
Much. Thank you all.
No, it's not.
really